My landlord handed me a vacancy notice on a Friday afternoon with a smile that had no warmth behind it. 3 years later, I handed him one back, and I was done smiling by then. I remember the exact details of that afternoon, the way you remember things that change the shape of your life without announcing themselves first. I was at the wheel, trimming the foot of a stoneware bowl I'd been working on since morning, and I heard the knock on the studio's front glass. When I came out wiping clay from my hands on my apron, my landlord was standing in the doorway in a pressed sport coat that probably cost more than my kiln rental, holding a manila envelope with the careful neutrality of someone who had done this before and had gotten comfortable with it. My name is Alma Reyes. I was 31 years old that afternoon, and I had spent 6 years building something real in that building. Reyes Clay Works wasn't a gallery or a boutique or a concept. It was a working ceramics studio in a 400-square-foot commercial bay in the Eastport Warehouse District. 8 pottery wheels bolted into their stations, 2 gas kilns I had sourced secondhand and wired with my father's help, a glaze mixing corner with open shelving I'd built from salvaged Douglas fir boards I'd found in a dumpster behind a flooring company 2 blocks over. The floors were concrete that I'd ground down, patched, and sealed myself over one brutal long weekend in my second year. The big north-facing windows, which I'd spent 2 winters trying to properly weather strip, threw a cold, even light across the work tables that photographers kept asking to use as backdrops. 3 nights a week I taught. Tuesday beginners, Thursday intermediate throwing, Saturday open studio. I had a 6-month waitlist for the beginner session. By the time I was 29, I had a retired mail carrier who'd been coming to my Thursday class for 4 years without missing a session. I had 2 high school kids from the neighborhood who came on Saturdays through a scholarship program I'd put together with a local arts foundation. I had an OBGYN who told me that throwing clay at 9 p.m. on Thursdays was the only hour of her week where she didn't think about anything except whether her walls were even. The studio was mine in the way something is yours when you've built it from nothing with your own hands and kept it alive through 3 years of a pandemic and a city construction project that blocked my loading entrance for 7 months. I'd signed the original lease at 24 with savings from 2 waitressing jobs and a $12,000 personal loan from my aunt. I had never missed a payment. Not once. My landlord, a man named Vincent Morrow, had inherited the building from his father along with 7 other commercial properties, spread across 2 neighborhoods. He was cordial in the formal, uninvested way of someone who has learned that cordiality costs nothing and gets you out of conversations faster. His nephew Lance managed the day-to-day. In 6 years I had spoken to Lance 4 times, 3 of which were about an HVAC unit that took 11 weeks and 2 ignored emails to repair. I had met Vincent himself perhaps twice a year, each visit brief, each conversation slightly beside the point. The envelope he handed me that Friday contained a notice of required vacancy. Page 3 of my commercial lease, a page I had not thought about since the week I signed it, contained Clause 14C, which permitted the landlord to require tenant vacancy for a period not to exceed 12 months if a licensed structural engineer determined the building required remediation work affecting occupancy safety. The notice cited a report from something called Cascade Structural Group and gave me 90 days to remove all equipment and personal property from the premises. Vincent said the remediation involved foundation stabilization. He said it was more extensive than they had anticipated. He said he was sorry for the inconvenience, using the word inconvenience the way you use it when you mean something closer to your problem now. He was smiling when he said it. Not a malicious smile, something almost reflexive, like the expression he defaulted to in moments that required nothing from him emotionally. I asked about a timeline for my return. He said it was still being determined. I moved my equipment out in stages over the following 6 weeks. My father drove up from Richmond to help me. He's a retired civil engineer, 32 years of structural assessments for the Virginia Department of Transportation, a man who looks at buildings the way other people look at faces, reading things the rest of us walk past without noticing. The second day of the move, while we were disassembling shelving, he stopped and stood very still in the center of the main floor with his head slightly tilted. I asked him what he was looking at. Foundation, he said. He walked the perimeter slowly, running his hand along the base of the load-bearing walls, crouching to look at where the walls met the slab, studying the column footings in the corners. He came back and leaned on the doorframe. Alma, he said, this building does not need foundation work. I asked what he meant. I mean, there's nothing here. Settling cracks along the east wall that are older than you are. Decades old, stable, not active. Nothing structural. Nothing that would require vacating a single tenant. I didn't know what to do with that information yet. I filed it away next to the feeling I'd had when Vincent handed me that envelope. I found a new space, a smaller unit in a converted textile mill 4 miles north of the warehouse district. Lower ceilings, a loading dock that required backing a truck down a narrow one-way alley, and rent $200 more a month for 2/3 the usable square footage. I lost students immediately. 3 dropped when they couldn't find parking. The retired couple who'd been coming every Thursday for 4 years stopped after 6 weeks because the new location added 40 minutes to their round trip. I taught through it. I kept the classes going. But the waitlist stopped growing, and the light in the new space was never the same. Flat and directional in a way that changed how the work looked before it was fired. 8 weeks after I vacated, the vacancy notice disappeared from my old building's front windows. A commercial listing appeared online. My exact unit, same square footage, same overhead windows, same freight elevator, asking rent of $3,100 per month. I had been paying $1,450. No work had been done to the building, not a single day of remediation, not one permit pulled. I know that second part because I looked. The county building department maintains a public permit portal, searchable by property address. I spent a Saturday morning going through every permit filed against that address for the previous 5 years. There was nothing, no structural permit, no remediation permit, no building inspection, no engineering report of any kind filed with the county. And when I searched the state's contractor license database for Cascade Structural Group, the name on the notice Vincent had handed me, it returned 0 results. No business registration, no license, no record of the company existing anywhere in the state. It was a company that did not exist. I could have stopped there. I thought about it seriously, the way you think seriously about things that would save you a great deal of pain. The energy required to pursue something like this is real, and the outcome is never guaranteed. And sometimes you lose more chasing justice than you lose by walking away from it. I had a studio to run, students to teach, a business I'd spent 6 years keeping alive. I could renegotiate my situation in the mill building, grow the new space, let it become just another story about a landlord and a small business that didn't survive a bad lease clause. But I kept coming back to the way Vincent had smiled handing me that envelope. Not cruel. Something almost worse than cruel. Indifferent. Like the entire transaction was a minor line item being cleared from a ledger. Like the floor I'd poured, the kilns I'd wired, the retired mail carrier who'd spent 4 years learning to center clay at my wheels. Like none of it had registered as anything worth a second thought. That indifference was what I couldn't let go of. It didn't dissolve. It settled into something harder and more deliberate. I kept the notice. I kept every email I'd ever exchanged with Lance. I photographed every surface of the old studio before I handed back the keys, timestamps embedded in the file metadata. I created a folder on my laptop that I labeled, with some private irony, 14C, and I started filling it without knowing exactly what I was building toward. I only knew that a landlord who could evict a 6-year paying tenant on the strength of a structural report from a company that didn't have a license in this state was a landlord who had done it before, and I wanted to know how many times. Finding the right attorney took 4 months and 3 useless consultations. The first 2 lawyers told me commercial lease disputes were difficult, that quantifying damages without clearer documentation was a challenge, that I should focus my energy on stabilizing the new location. A third seemed interested until she realized I wasn't in a position to fund a lengthy litigation. My cousin, who works in nonprofit housing advocacy in Baltimore, pointed me toward a woman named Agatha Fenn, who ran a small firm in the city's legal district, specializing in commercial tenant rights. She'd spent 12 years at a major real estate firm before going out on her own, and she had a reputation among tenant advocates for taking cases that other lawyers filed under too complicated to be worth the effort. I met her on a Wednesday afternoon with my laptop and a printed folder that had grown considerably thicker over those 4 months. She read through everything without commentary for close to 20 minutes. Then she pulled up a county assessor's database on her own monitor and typed in Vincent Morrow's name. "He's done this before," she said, not a hypothesis. A statement with the flat certainty of someone who recognized a pattern before she'd finished reading it. She was right, and proving it fully took nearly a year of careful, quiet work. Using public records, old filings with the city's Small Business Commission, and interviews Agatha conducted with former tenants she tracked down through lease assignment records and expired business license renewals, we mapped a pattern going back 11 years. 4 other commercial tenants across 3 of Vincent's properties. A glass repair shop that had operated in the same location for a decade. A small immigration legal aid clinic. A family-owned print shop that had been in its location for 19 years and served the surrounding neighborhood in ways that couldn't be measured in square footage. A music school that drew mostly kids from the public elementary school 2 blocks away. In each case, the vacancy notice cited a structural or code compliance concern. In each case, the engineering firm named on the notice either didn't exist in state records or had no record of filing a report with the county. In each case, the tenant vacated within 90 days. In each case, the unit was relisted at substantially higher rent within 6 weeks. In no case had any remediation work ever been completed. 4 businesses. 4 separate notices. 4 separate smiles at 4 separate doors. None of them had known about the others. They'd each been one story, and Vincent had kept it that way deliberately, across more than a decade. I asked Agatha if we should sue him. She laid out what that would look like. Complex commercial litigation, possibly 3 to 4 years, a settlement offer calculated to be large enough to make us feel like we'd won but small enough for Vincent to absorb without disrupting his operations. A civil judgment wouldn't touch his portfolio. It wouldn't change the mechanism. The next tenant after me would still be sitting on a lease with a Clause 14C, and no way to know what it had already cost 5 other people. I wanted something more permanent than a number on a check. I called my father. He already knew the rough shape of what I was thinking. I hadn't said it directly, but he'd understood from the weekends we'd spent in the county deed records office together that I was looking for something beyond legal remedy. My father understands leverage the way he understands load-bearing structures, as a force that has to be placed correctly to do what you need it to do. You need capital, he said, and you need to understand the full title picture on that building before you commit to anything. That second piece turned out to be the one that mattered most. He spent the next 3 Saturdays with me in the county register's office, working through the ownership history on every building in Vincent's portfolio. He read title chains and easement language the way I read glaze chemistry, fluently, without needing to slow down to translate. In the deed records for my original building, buried in a 2009 development agreement that had been recorded with the county and was technically public but rarely read past the first 2 pages, he found something that changed the entire direction of what I was planning. Vincent's father had received a tax incentive package from the city that year as part of an urban commercial revitalization initiative. The agreement contained a deed restriction requiring that the ground floor commercial units be maintained for small business occupancy at below market rates for 10 years. That restriction had expired in 2019, but the same agreement contained a right of first refusal clause. If the property was ever offered for sale, tenants with more than 3 years of continuous occupancy had the right to match any purchase offer within 60 days of the listing date. I had been a continuous tenant for 6 years at the time of the eviction. Agatha spent 3 weeks verifying whether a fraudulent eviction preserved or voided that right. She called in a second opinion from a real property law professor at the State University Law School. The answer came back, because I had never voluntarily surrendered my lease. Because the termination itself was achieved through fraudulent means. My continuous tenancy argument had standing. If the building was ever offered for sale, I had a legal basis to exercise the right of first refusal. So I needed to make the building go up for sale. That part required patience more than cleverness, 2.5 years of it. I ran the mill building studio lean, tighter margins, longer hours, wedding and event contracts I would have turned down before out of plain exhaustion. Levi, my partner, is quiet by nature and precise in the way that people who work in municipal finance tend to be, and he spent his evenings during that period building financial models of Vincent's likely debt positions from public assessor records and property tax filings. We brought in 2 outside investors, my aunt, who had believed in me since the day she made that first loan, and a former student of mine who had done well in tech and trusted my judgment enough to back it with money. We formed a small LLC under a name that had no connection to me or to the studio. Vincent had no reason to connect what we were building with anyone he had ever evicted. Agatha, working in parallel, filed a formal complaint with the city's Office of Consumer Protection documenting the full pattern. All 5 evictions, all 5 non-existent engineering firms, all 5 units relisted within weeks of vacancy. It was an administrative complaint rather than a lawsuit, which meant it triggered a review rather than a docket number. That review made its way to a commercial code enforcement officer who opened an inquiry into Vincent's portfolio. Inquiries of that kind create uncertainty in ways that lawsuits sometimes don't. Uncertainty around a leveraged commercial real estate portfolio makes lenders nervous. When lenders get nervous, margins get called. When margins get called, properties move to market. 18 months after we filed the complaint, my original building appeared as a commercial listing at $2.4 million. Agatha sent the right of first refusal notice to the seller's attorney before the listing had been active for 5 days. The 60 days that followed were the hardest stretch of the entire effort, harder, honestly, than the original eviction had been, because this time I had built something toward a specific outcome, and I could feel the possibility of losing it in a concrete way that early grief doesn't allow. Our financing had to be restructured twice because of an interest rate shift that tightened our debt coverage ratios in a way our original model hadn't accounted for. In week 4, one of our 2 outside investors called me on a Sunday night. He wasn't unkind. He had his own pressures, his own reasons, and he explained them quietly, and I understood them even while I was sitting on my kitchen floor after the call trying to work out what our position looked like without his share. Levi was at the table with a notepad when I came back in. He'd already been on the phone with our broker while I was still absorbing the call. He didn't say it would be fine or that we'd figure it out. He said, "Here's what the numbers look like without him, and here's the gap we need to close." We spent 2 days restructuring the offer with a modified loan package and a contribution adjustment from my aunt, who increased her stake without being asked and without making anything of it. My father drove up and stayed for 4 days. He made coffee every morning, did not offer opinions I hadn't asked for, and was simply present in the way that certain people know how to be when things are at the edge of working or not working. On the 3rd day, he sat at my kitchen table and said, very matter-of-factly, "The deal is going to close, Alma." He said it the way he used to tell me, when I was a kid watching him read load calculations on blueprints, that a structure would hold. Not as reassurance exactly, more as a statement of what the math indicated. The deal closed on a Thursday in October. I didn't contact Vincent. I didn't change any public-facing listing status. I let 2 full weeks pass while Agatha confirmed every recorded instrument, every title transfer, every filing. She wanted the chain of ownership airtight and fully documented before anyone outside our group knew what had changed. On a Monday morning in November, a certified letter went out from her office addressed to Vincent Morrow. It informed him that as of the recording date in October, ownership of the building had transferred to our LLC, and that a storage arrangement he had maintained informally in the building's basement, a holdover from his father's era that had never been formally addressed, was being reviewed by the new ownership. He came to the mill building studio the following afternoon. I heard the front door and looked up from the glazing table, and he was just standing in the doorway in the same gray overcoat. I recognized from the Friday he'd handed me that envelope. He looked at the studio, the lower ceiling, the cramped layout, the shelving half the size of what I'd had in the original space. He was quiet for a long moment, then his eyes found mine. "You bought the building," he said. "My LLC did," I said. "That property has been in my family for 30 years. He said it quietly without heat, like he was stating something he was still reconciling. "I know," I said. "I read the full title history. Both of us have been in that building a long time." He looked at me. "Do you have any idea what I put into that portfolio?" "I know what I put into that space," I said. "I know what it cost me to move 2 kilns and 8 pottery wheels out in 90 days because of a structural report from an engineering firm that doesn't have a license in this state." He didn't deny it. That was the thing I hadn't fully anticipated. He didn't claim there had been a real report, didn't suggest I'd misread the situation, didn't try to argue the merits of what he'd done. He stood there with the look of someone who had been good at something for a long time and had just encountered its limit. "What are you going to do with the building?" he said. "Renovate it," I said, "with permits, with a licensed contractor, the way it was supposed to happen the first time." He left without another word. The administrative complaint Agatha had filed moved faster after the ownership transfer became public record. The family that had run the print shop and the attorney, who had operated the immigration legal aid clinic, both filed their own formal grievances once they learned the documented pattern existed. Two of Vincent's remaining properties came under assessor scrutiny for income reporting irregularities. His commercial insurance carrier sent an audit team. Lance stopped managing the remaining portfolio within 6 weeks and stopped returning calls from tenants who needed repairs. I heard about this secondhand through a business owner in one of those buildings who tracked me down after seeing a local news story about the ownership transfer. I don't know what passed between Lance and Vincent after everything came to light. I only know what was visible in the records. About 8 weeks after Vincent had stood in my doorway at the mill building, a letter arrived at Agatha's office addressed to me. Not through his attorney, addressed to me directly. In handwriting I didn't recognize immediately. 2 paragraphs. In the first, he wrote that the vacancy notices had been business decisions he had made without adequately considering what they actually cost the people on the other side of them. In the second, he said he was sorry it had taken this specific outcome for him to say that. I read it twice. I placed it in the 14C folder, next to the original notice of required vacancy, the county permit portal screenshots showing no remediation work ever filed, the contractor license database printout with 0 results for Cascade Structural Group, and the 2009 development agreement my father had found buried in a deed index that no one had opened in 15 years. 1 folder, both ends of the story. Reyes Clay Works moved back into the original space 10 months after the purchase closed. Real renovations. Permitted, inspected, done by a crew my father helped me vet. A new electrical panel sized for 2 additional kilns. Roof ventilation repairs that had been deferred since before I'd signed my first lease. An ADA-compliant entrance that actually met code, rather than the version that had nominally met code when the building changed hands from Vincent's father to him. The concrete floor I'd ground and sealed in year 2 was still there underneath everything, and when the contractor asked whether we wanted to pour over it, I said no. We worked around it. That floor was part of what the building was. My father was there the morning we reopened. He stood in the center of the main floor doing the slow, observant turn he does when he's reading the structural logic of a space, and then he stopped and looked at the teaching corner I'd rebuilt a few feet wider than it had been before. "You gained some square footage," he said. 62 feet, I said. He nodded once, like that was the correct and obvious amount, and then we went to make coffee in the back room while the first students of the morning started arriving and filling up the wheel stations. Levi proposed 6 weeks after the reopening. In the studio on a Tuesday evening after the beginner class had finished and the last student had closed the door behind her, and we were standing in the quiet of the space with still damp work drying on every shelf around us. Nothing staged. He's not a planned gesture kind of person, and neither am I. He's a Tuesday evening in the right room person, and it turned out that was exactly what I'd needed all along. We got married the following spring in the back of the studio, surrounded by pieces that students had made over the years. Bowls and mugs and lopsided vases I'd held onto because they were someone's first attempt at something, because they marked the beginning of something someone had chosen to start. I still keep the original vacancy notice, in the same folder as everything that came after it, including the letter in handwriting I had to read twice to recognize. Not because I need either of them as evidence of anything. I have the deed, the floor, the students on the wait list, the windows that finally don't leak, the building in my name as evidence enough of what happened and what it cost. I keep them because the distance between those 2 pieces of paper is the whole story, and the whole story is worth knowing. Some people spend their lives trying to move past where they were wronged. I spent mine building something more permanent than anger. I bought back what I'd already built, and then I made it 62 square feet bigger.